Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this latest installment of the Resistance Bureau. This is a program that spotlights issues surrounding democracy and the struggle for freedom in Africa. Today, we're focusing on West Africa. We're highlighting some growing concerns there, but we're also exploring how pro-democracy activists and human rights defenders are pushing back. I'm your host today. My name is Adiola Fayeon, and I'm here today with my co-host and my brother, that is Jeffrey Smith. We're also joined by Mantete Munashwa and Professor Nick Chaseman, who will moderate today's Q&A session. If you have any questions for the panel during today's program, please send us a note on WhatsApp by using this number, that is +263 77 623 8199. As always, you can also keep track of this discussion on Twitter by following us at Resist Bureau, and make sure to use the hashtag Resist Bureau Live. Right now, we are streaming on Facebook Live and on YouTube, and this show will also be recorded for later distribution.
Thank you so much, Adiola, for that kind introduction and for hosting today's important program along with me. And thanks as well to the many viewers worldwide who have tuned in today. To be sure, the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS as it's better known, has been one of the most democratic regional groupings in all of Africa. According to Freedom House, as one example, no region in Africa has made more democratic progress over the last quarter century. I personally recall hopes in the region being especially high as recently as 2017, when solidarity, backed up by the threat of military intervention, helped to force out the Gambia's then long-ruling dictator Yahya Jammeh after he had lost in a historic election. Recently, however, a growing number of West African states have faltered, suffering major democratic declines, and we've seen some worrying trends. This includes presidents in Ivory Coast and Guinea, most recently, securing controversial third terms in office after forcing through constitutional changes. Long an authoritarian outlier in the region, the Nsingbe dynasty in Togo has further entrenched its own military rule, barely eliciting an outside response, which has perhaps provided a blueprint to other would-be autocrats in the region. In Nigeria, where just 5 years ago, President Buhari won as an opposition candidate and inspired some cautious optimism worldwide, police brutality and killings, in addition to government corruption and misrule, has triggered massive ongoing protests. And the recent military intervention in Mali has raised new and credible fears of a return to the era of coups, counter-coups, and regional instability. Today's program will examine why democracy is facing these and similar setbacks across the region. Just as importantly, we will look at the ways in which civil society, human rights defenders, and opposition political parties and their leaders are fighting back against these encroachments. We will also look to Ghana, still a democratic beacon for the continent, for lessons about how to strengthen democracy and to look ahead as that country gears up for general elections next month. There is a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. Adiola, over to you.
Yeah, and joining us today to talk about all these issues, we have an amazing lineup of experts and leaders. First up is Jude Moore. He's a former Minister of Public Works in Liberia, where he served in the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf administration until January 2018. Jude is a prolific writer, and you will often see him quoted in major international media publications due to his wide range expertise on African affairs. Currently, he's a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C. And to his immense credit, he has joined this program at the very last minute due to some reshuffling that we had to do. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jude.
My pleasure. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Also, we have Farida Bembarnabarema, who's a pioneering writer, human rights defender, Pan-Africanist, and a good friend of ours at the Resistance Bureau. She founded the Four Must Go movement in Togo, and she's a leading activist who has worked tirelessly to ensure that the dictatorial government of Faure Gnassingbé and others in the region come to an end. She's also the co-founder and executive director of the Togolese Civil League. Farida, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adiola.
Also joining us today is Nadia Neyman, a political operative and a rising star in the Guinea and the wider West African region. She's an expert in human rights law and currently serves as the chief of staff and official spokeswoman for Guinea's main opposition leader, Silao Dallo, who's disputing the most recent election result in that region. Ms. Nadia, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
And finally, we have with us Professor Jammeh, who is a legend in the fields of democracy and development. He's a co-founder and former executive director of Afrobarometer, which now collects survey data in over 30 African countries. He's been honored multiple times for his scholarship, including most recently in 2018 by the African Studies Association. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's an honor to be here.
So thanks to every one of you for having you and for sharing your expertise. So I'd like to start with Jude, since you were kind enough to join us as a very late edition. Thank you so much. And I obviously like to keep the pressure up and come to you for the first question. As a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, you closely track events at the regional level. And we all know that there has been some concerning developments in West Africa, including term limits being removed by some presidents and seriously flawed elections taking place in certain countries. So the question is, what challenges do you see as the most pressing in the West African region right now? And the other question is, what are you seeing in terms of broader trends? Can we, in fact, say that democracy is on the retreat in West Africa or not?
Once again, thanks for having me. And I'm a statist. Having been in government, I've seen upfront closely the impact that a government can have on its people. And just before I respond to the question, I know that when President Sirleaf came to power as a woman, that she would go for these events in the interior part of the country. And women would tell her that before she became president, when they went to these meetings, they basically just sat there and the men spoke. But after she became president, it was now acceptable, even expected, that a woman would lead, that a woman would speak. Now, obviously, maybe our traditional institutions would have evolved on their own to allow that to happen, but it took a government coming to power and being that. But I've also seen the difficulty if the government is not working in terms of its people. So I think the story of democracy in West Africa has been moving in a single direction. That is, it has gotten better over time, but it has not been linear, but it's been subject to backsliding, and we've seen that again. I mean, up to today, we still have not, and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf remains the first and only woman who was elected in a democratic election, and that happened in West Africa. None of that would have happened without ECOWAS intervention in Liberia, and we saw the same thing. However, there is this, it's hard to know how to describe this because, the president of Guinea-Bissau, he called it a constitutional coup, where incumbents sort of manipulate the democratic institutions and change their term limits, right? Change the constitution so that they can be able to stay in power. I think it is a positive that they don't do it by fiat and force, but it's also a negative that they're changing. Constitutions are supposed to be very difficult to change, and to see them do that. So I think the risk here is that this becomes a trend, that other presidents, when the time comes for them to leave office, see it as a means of being able to stay longer in power. And I think if you look on the horizon in terms of the political risk to the democratic process across the continent, that would be that presidents begin to see that as a viable way of staying in power. I would just say, though, that on the Côte d'Ivoire front, it's kind of hard to be able to see that because until Koulibaly passed away, it looked as if Alassane Ouattara was going to walk away, and then he didn't. Obviously, he shouldn't have run for a third term, but I am more optimistic about the path of the democratic process across the region, in spite of the risks that these actions pose.
So definitely we would have follow-ups to that, but just speaking as a Nigerian, I agree with you in some ways. At the same time, I feel like we've been really slow, like we've taken some steps towards positivity and more steps backwards. That's just my personal opinion, but we'll still get back to that. But I want to bring up Professor Jammeh, and I like to bring him in here because Afrobarometer keeps close tabs on regional trends through its numerous insightful surveys. So what does the data tell us about the region's democratic decline? I want us to take a look at data right now. And in what areas is it more apparent? Just as important, what are the citizens' perception of these apparent setbacks?
Great question, and I think great opening to this discussion on the question of term limits. So we've been tracking support for term limits across Africa, including West Africa, for some time now. And I can tell you that it is the most popular, the popular subscription to the idea of two-term limits on presidential tenure is high. And in West Africa, you are talking of about 80% of the population across the board, adult population, that says they prefer that. And this has remained so. And so a country like Guinea, where the president has just maneuvered himself into a third term, as many as 79 or so % of Guineans express support for term limit. So that tells you something about the general support for democratic norms and democratic institutions across Africa, and especially in West Africa. That's a very strong support for the ballot box as the mechanism for choosing governments, strong support for multi-party democracy as opposed to single party. And then when you ask question about whether they prefer democracy to any other system of government, again, you get very strong endorsement, and you get even much stronger, more resounding rejection of all the three alternative non-democratic forms of government. So there's strong rejection of military rule, strong rejection of one-party rule, and strong rejection of one-man rule. Just one more piece of statistics to share on this. When you ask them about whether they prefer a government that is effective but not accountable, or a government that is accountable even if it's not so effective, you get a majority, a solid majority, saying that they prefer a government that is accountable. If you take all of that together, that is a ringing endorsement and ringing demand for democracy, democratic norms, and support for democratic norms and institutions. But that is not so when it comes to perceived supply, the extent to which they feel they are being supplied with democratic governance, they are being supplied with clean elections, they are being supplied with a government that is responsive to the needs of the people. When you track it along the supply line, the supply function, then you do get a wide gap between expectations, aspirations versus delivery.
Yes. Over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is actually a really great segue and an ideal time to bring in Nadia here. Obviously, being from Guinea, that country is one of the more starker examples of a rapid decline in terms of respect for democracy and human rights. Not too long ago, before he was president, Alpha Conde was a pro-democracy campaigner himself. He was a perennial thorn in the sides of the country's powers that be. And now, as we've just been hearing, fast forward a decade, and he's just secured a third term in office following a flawed and violent election in which his regime crushed dissent and opposition to his rule. So Nadia, a really straightforward but perhaps difficult question to answer here. What happened? What happened in Guinea?
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for this relevant question. As Robert Caro said, power doesn't corrupt, power reveals. Alpha Conde was the hope for all young generations of Guineans, including myself, because he has been fighting for democracy, rule of law, and last but not least for political alternation for over 40 decades. That's why French President Emmanuel Macron said that Alpha Conde has a career as an opponent which would have justified that he organizes democratic alternation on his own. But power has revealed to us a man who didn't practice what he preached for, a complete shame. I would like to quote our former Constitutional Court President, Mr. Khalifa Sall, who passed away very sadly. During the investiture ceremony following the re-election, the so-called re-election of Alpha Condé in 2015, he stated that take care not to succumb to the revisionist sirens, for while the Guinean people have given you and renewed their trust, they remain legitimately vigilant. Very sadly, Alpha Condé succumbed to these revisionist sirens, and he offers us a shining examples of change of the constitution. Since he changed the constitution 7 months before the end of his second and last term of office, with the sole aim to run for more 6 years terms of office. What is ironic is when he changed the constitution, he introduced term limitation in the constitution. So curiously enough, the constitution introduced was not the same one that people voted on in a so his decision, Alpha Condé's decision to run again, is setting the country back decades in terms of democracy and rule of law. In order to reach this third term in office, it's important to recall that 150 Guineans have been killed by security forces with impunity since October 2019. We moved from a constitutional coup d'etat, to an electoral coup. And in order to get through its electoral masquerade, Alpha Condé, in the aftermath of the elections, unleashed a vast campaign of violence and intimidation against the winner of this election, the genuine winner of this election, Mr. Cellou Dalein Diallo, and its supporters. A witch hunt is currently organized to muzzle the opposition for arbitrary arrests, arbitrary detentions. We registered 350 unlawful arrests right now and the confiscation of private properties of the Fulanis community. Mr. Cellou Dalein Diallo was sequestrated at home for about 10 days. The building houses of our offices and our quarters are still occupied by the army, by the police and the gendarmerie. And the bloody repression that has fallen on its activists had left 49 people dead, 240 injured by bullet, and a lot of arrests, as I mentioned. So now the situation is that exercising the right to freedom of peaceful assembly can lead to death with the extreme militarization of policing. And military personnel have regularly been deployed in operations supposedly related to law enforcement. Now in Guinea, ban of demonstrations and crackdown on demonstration have become a routine. And I would like to end this first part by quoting a Senegalese analyst who said that if the Guinean levy jumps, the entire ECOWAS plan will be flooded with third terms. So once again, if the Guinean levy jumps, the entire ECOWAS plan will be flooded with third terms. And I think that our friends from Senegal and other West African countries are watching us.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nadia, just a quick follow-up question for you. As someone who has worked in a leadership position with a main opposition party in Guinea, what's next for your movement? You mentioned this so-called election, this election that you believe and your party believe were stolen from you, and you've claimed to have the vote tallies to prove as much. But also, a two-part question: what avenues are left to dispute these results, if any? But I think perhaps more importantly, what our listeners would like to know, and what I would certainly like to know, is how do you enforce these valid grievances while also working towards building the needed national security, the peace and the stability that will enable the country to prosper moving forward?
Thank you very much. Jeffrey, our movement is the movement of democracy. We all notice that in the coming decades, one of our biggest challenge will be preserving the future of our democracies. The election has been stolen indeed, but it does not mean that the battle is over. When you take a closer look to it, the battle is actually only starting. What Guinea is facing is what many countries will be facing in the coming years. And we need to see this as an opportunity to create alternative and creative ways to fight the battle. The first step for us after designing a robust technological approach for transparent election is to leverage on our community to organize. As you know, as I recall, the capital city of Conakry is occupied by the army. This to avoid any citizen movement. The street has been taken away from us. We are now focusing on detailed and organic organization within our movement. In all cities, all villages of Guinea, people are organized. What is at stake now? What is at stake now for Mr. Condé is tremendous, is huge. Guinea is one of the most corrupted countries in the world. The alliances with countries like China, Turkey, Russia that are not so fond of human rights as you all know, help in pursuing this authoritarian posture of Alpha Condé. So what we need from the good democracy of this world is to assist us in preserving what we believe as being the best part of a common future. We want to be able to fight for the biggest challenging ahead of us, climate change, ending poverty, gender equality. The avenues here, the forest growing, and we also need assistance and coordination from the greatest democracy. They need to do better, and to do better is a strong cooperation. Strong cooperation is the best way possible for the greatest democracy to speak in one voice, and we wish they were more vocal and organized too.
Thank you, Nadia. Adiola, over to you.
Yeah, I want to come to Farida real quick because Farida, you've been at the forefront of the democratic struggle in Togo for a long time, which a lot of people have described as the most repressive regime in West Africa. So in many ways, you have been out there, you've done that, shedding light, bringing awareness to what is happening in Togo. You've spoken on world arenas in different parts of the world. And my question is, are these attacks on democracy across the region any surprise to you? Also, what lessons which you have learned would you like to share with activists in other countries, especially such as Guinea, like in bringing awareness to what is happening in their country?
Adiola, thank you very much for your question. When I was listening to my sister Nadia speaking about the situation in Guinea, I was smiling, but that was kind of like a cynical smile because I see a lot of how do you call it? Basically, a lot of replica
similarities.
Of Togo. Yes, that's the word. A lot of similarities between the situation in Togo and Guinea. This does not come to me as a surprise at all. On the contrary, for many years now, as the citizens of Togo, we have been raising an alert about the need for the government of Togo to be held accountable and for us to gain the support necessary to get rid of the military regime in Togo. Alpha Condé, a few months prior to the elections in Guinea, did an interview in which he said, in other countries, people are doing 4 terms or more, and why is everybody complaining about my 3rd term? Those he's referring to as other countries is literally Togo, because prior to Alpha Condé securing his 3rd term last October and Alassane Ouattara securing his 3rd term last October, Togo was the only country in the region that has not had democratic transition for the past 50 years. We have had the same family in power for 53 years, and Faure Gnassingbé himself secured a 4th term this year. So for us, we felt like Togo is the spoiled fruit in the basket. And for as long as you leave Togo in that basket, it's going to contaminate others, because these leaders, they work together. The very interesting thing about Togo is that when the Togolese citizens rose massively against the Nyasimbe family in 2017, the government of Togo expressly chose Alpha Condé as the mediator. For the dialogue between the opposition and themselves. And there were those of us in the opposition who believed that we couldn't entrust our mediation in the hands of Alpha Condé, who is aspiring for a third term. But then there were other factions in the opposition who were like, those ideas of third terms in Guinea are just rumors. And Alpha Condé has been a long-standing democratic factor, and he has ensured and promised to us in the opposition of Togo that he will help us bring an end to dictatorship in Togo. Well, the results, we have it now. Nyasimbe got himself another term, and he also got himself another term. My fear, however, is that this is going to spread because the institutions in our countries are so weak. And a few years ago, the reason why this region seems to be making progress doesn't entirely depend on the power of institutions. Our institutions are not resilient. As a result, we basically entrust our democracy in the goodwill of the leaders. If any cynical leader comes to power in any of those countries, be it Liberia, be it Sierra Leone, be it Guinea-Bissau, Mali, or Niger, if any of them feel like using force to maintain themselves in power, I am very afraid to say that they will have a free way to do it, just like Ouattara did it in Côte d'Ivoire and Alpha Condé did it in Guinea. So this is like an important call for us to understand that the democracy in our region, it looks good on paper, but we need to consolidate it because the institutions are very weak. And the people have been made to believe that once they elect a new government, then they have established a democracy. But once these democracies are faced with challenges and people demanding accountability from them, like is the case in Nigeria, automatically they reveal their faces as authoritarian governments. So that's my intake on all of this.
Farida, thank you for that. You know, you and I have long talked about these issues and about the importance of, in particular, public advocacy and awareness raising on human rights abuses, and how media attention, as just one small example, may help to hold leaders in some of these countries accountable. Obviously, that always isn't enough. So having worked across the region with activists and you know, being with you around the world and meeting activists who are fighting dictatorship, not just in Africa, but elsewhere. What strategies, you know, have you personally found to be most effective? And what do you think might work best in this context of West Africa, which has additional barriers that don't exist elsewhere? For instance, the fact that we have a mix of French and English speaking countries. I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I will say that despite the language barrier, there is a pretty good sense of communication among activists across the region. I see Togolese activists working with Nigerian and Ghanaian activists. I see Ivorian activists working with Liberian activists and vice versa. For me, it's not so a matter of language barrier that is the issue. However, the issue for me is about us running a diagnostic of democracy in West Africa and trying to understand at each country level what are the trends and what are the risk level of a government abusing their power and abusing the system. Because it's more a matter of people who believe that they are smarter than everybody and they're entitled to be in government, who actually jeopardize the democratic space for everyone. And unfortunately, they are reinforced in that by impunity because there is really no instrument available to hold them accountable in the region. We have talked about the ECOWAS, for example. In the case of Togo, the government of Togo has lost many legal battles at the ECOWAS court. They were asked to pay fines. They were asked to take, there were sanctions taken against them. But unfortunately, this didn't yield any results because they don't see the ECOWAS as being powerful enough to scare them or to make them change their tactics. So we have to identify at the regional level what instruments are available to us to be able to hold our leaders accountable, to be able to protect our institutions and especially the constitutions of our country from being manipulated to the advantage of an individual. And that is going to require a very thorough collaboration between activists and policymakers in the region. Unfortunately, it is a little bit difficult at this point because each country sees their own reality as the priority, and we are rather in a system of responding to crisis than preventing the crisis from happening.
Thank you so much. Adeola, back over to you.
Yeah. So before I go to Professor Jammeh real quick, Farida, I just wanted to ask you one last question, like just how Guinea can bring more awareness to what is happening there. I feel like in Africa, we don't really, so many countries, we don't care about what's happening in other countries unless we're directly affected by what's happening there. So how can the people of Guinea get the attention of all of Nigerians, for example, or the attention of South Africans, the attention of Kenyans, like, hey, this is happening, you need to care about it?
Thank you, Adeola. That is a great question. And we did face the same thing in Togo a few years ago. From my personal experience, I believe that the best way to do is to reach out directly to people and to visit communities in those countries. I basically travel to almost every single country in West Africa advocating for Togo, organizing press conferences in each of those countries, meeting with policymakers, meeting with activists in the region, meeting with journalists. And those networks have helped us spread the message about the realities on Togo. We kind of like through the press conferences, we basically had media coverage on the situation in Togo, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, in Senegal. And we were also able to speak with policymakers and even ECOWAS lawmakers in countries like the Gambia, Senegal, and Ghana, who were very supportive of us and who even brought the situation of Togo at the ECOWAS sessions. So I feel like it has to be done the classic way, one-on-one communication. It can't be done. It's a work that is very heavy. It shouldn't be done by one person. But I know the Guineans have a very big diaspora, just like the Togolese do. So the diaspora can also contribute massively in raising awareness in different countries, not just in the West African region, but beyond at the regional level and the global level.
Thank you so much for that. And real quick, I want to come back to Professor Jammeh. I'd like to ask you, because in so many ways, Ghana remains a democratic exemplar, not just for West Africa, but for the entire continent. So the question is, will this upcoming election in Ghana, because they have an election coming up December 7th, will this election continue this trajectory? Is Ghana immune to these democratic concerns that we're talking about? Or are there issues that our listeners and those in the broader pro-democracy community should be tracking in these coming weeks when it comes to Ghana?
Thank you, Adeola. Great question. But with your permission, I'd like to look back to some of the broader issues that Farida and Nadia had put on the table regarding what may be done to avert and to push back on the democratic backsliding that we are suffering in West Africa. And I just wanted to remind all of us that West Africa and ECOWAS in particular is a place and it's an original body that a few years ago, as recently as about 3 years ago, they had considered making a two-term presidential limit and presidential tenure a norm across West Africa. And guess who were the two? It was opposed initially by Yahya Jammeh, and then after him, it was opposed by Yahya Jammeh. So we made a lot of progress. This is a region where you had the John Kufuors, you had the Obasanjos, you had others pulling together to enforce democratic norms. So one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, what can we do to reload ECOWAS and ECOWAS leadership, or to push some of our leaders to be more proactive in the monitoring and promotion and encouragement of democratic governance progress across the country, across West Africa, knowing that whatever happens in Nigeria and whatever winds blow there will blow across the rest of West Africa and vice versa. So that's one. Second is that we in civil society, we are citizens across the region who have espoused strong support for democracy and democratic norms. we should also be doing what we can to show solidarity and to draw attention. And so it's sitting in Ghana, sometimes I think we Ghanaians focus too much on Ghana issues, and it makes me almost unhappy to talk about Ghana democracy because we are always talking about ourselves. But because you asked me, I will talk about Ghana and the upcoming elections. First, just to say that under normal circumstances, I think Ghanaians have imbibed and internalized the idea of 2 terms per president and governing party, making a total of 8 years. But we now have, for the first time in the current republic, 2 parties and 2 presidential candidates, both of whom have had their 1 term in office and want to get a second crack at it. And so it makes for a reasonable, it forms a basis for competition. We have the records of the fairly recent record of the Mahama NDC administration with the very, very fresh record of the Akufo-Addo NPP administration. So there is an electoral competition, a very keen one going on right now. Now, in terms of, but in general, I think that first COVID-19 has sort of rigged the process somewhat in favor of the incumbent government, because after all, for about several months, political activities generally froze. And all you had was the president doing bi-weekly broadcasts announcing COVID-19 reliefs and updating the country on progress that has been made in fighting the pandemic. Plus, it's also provided an opportunity for the government to show itself and to present itself as a provider of welfare, the provider of the security and health protection of the citizens, and that also gives a fairly strong advantage. And then in general, I think when we look at the Ghanaian subscription to the idea of 2-term limits, a president and a party in its first term is not really expected to face a whole lot of competition, and that there are specific historical reasons, specific episodes that explain why President Mahama could not get a second term immediately after completing the first one. In terms of negative things to look out for in the upcoming election is the possibility of electoral violence. Why this is so? This is so because in the previous elections, Ghana's elections have always been marked by a certain level of extreme levels of tension and a certain level of political violence, electoral violence. Just that it's almost always been, we've succeeded in containing it, and that civil society, especially with a strong combination of the religious leadership, Muslim, Christian, as well as secular civil society, has worked together and always managed somewhat to save the elections from going south. And then typically, as soon as the elections are over, we are all euphoric about having achieved yet another successful election and the outcomes accepted, and then we move on. This time around, I'm a bit worried because in a recent by-election in Ghana, in Accra, one of the Accra constituencies, there was election violence. It was recorded, it was on television, it was captured on social media, and so on. Government set up a committee to review the causes. The committee did a fantastic job, made recommendations for both parties have managed to hold on to their so-called vigilantes. And I'm afraid that some of these vigilante groups that belong to parties and belong to individuals within parties and belong to individuals supporting the various, one of the two main candidates or another, may spark violence, and then it may spark overreaction and things could get out of hand. Second concern is that from a survey that CDD Ghana conducted, a pre-election survey late September, mid-October, they found that there was significant concern about the wrong vote tally being announced. And we put it down to one major factor. The members, the current Electoral Commission of Ghana is new. This is the first election they are organizing. And all three of the leadership were appointed by the president as the law and constitution permits, without any consultation with the opposition. And given the fact that they came to replace the previous commissioners who were all impeached for real offenses, for real breaches of their office and abuse of office and so on. But the fact is that you have three commissioners, the leadership of the commission that was appointed under President Mahama have now been replaced by a leadership, all three of whom are appointed by President Akufo-Addo, and in keeping with Ghanaian political traditions, unilaterally. So a deep, deep well of mistrust has built over the commission from the standpoint of the opposition party. And this is part of what is generating this feeling that maybe this new commission cannot be trusted by the main opposition party. And then to just tie it all up, all of this boils down to the fact that Ghanaians have truly embraced the ballot box as the sole mechanism for choosing governments, and yet the two parties and the two main presidential candidates are really just after power for the sake of taking control over the state and whatever is under the control of the state. So this is basically a proxy war for state capture. And because of that, never mind all the progress Ghana has made, it is possible that these two parties and these two leaders who have tasted power and know power is very sweet in Ghana, and Ghana is now the Ghanaian state treasury is much bigger, it's much larger, partly thanks to oil and gas, and that if you capture the state, everything else follows. And so we are truly living in Nkrumah's aphorism that seek ye first the political kingdom, all other things will be added. And if you have to kill and maim for it, this is my addition. Do it.
Thank you so much, Professor. And thank you for ending on that note. Seek ye first democracy. All right, Jeff, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And since we're running a bit short on time, Judy, I'd love to bring you back in here. We've talked a lot about institutions in the ECOWAS region. So on a more positive side, the region still is home to perhaps the strongest regional court on the continent, and that being, of course, the ECOWAS Court of Justice, in which individuals have direct access, a rarity on the continent. And you have argued at the very outset of the show, for instance, that despite some of the backsliding we've been talking about today, the overall trajectory has been a positive one over the past decade. So, and you heard Farida also talk about how the region looks good on paper, but in practice, it's been lacking. So perhaps on a more positive side, in your opinion and in your experience and in your research, your expertise, what additional mechanisms of solidarity exist in the region beyond the ECOWAS Court, for instance, to support human rights and to build solidarity and respect for democratic principles? And in these next few minutes before we go to our Q&A session, I'd like to tack on a bit of a different question, because I know you've written a bit about the role of China and its growing clout in the region. What can or should African leaders be doing right now to stand together and to not be further pushed around by Beijing?
So obviously, thanks again. And obviously everything Farida said, what Nadia said, and some of the stuff Jima spoke about, all of those threats and risks exist. And I think it's important to acknowledge them, as I did from the beginning. But I've also tried to point out that if you go back 20 years, if you go back, 30 years to where we were in terms of the democratic process in the region, we're much better today than we were. Obviously, we're not going as fast as we should, and we aren't. It isn't as expansive in terms of the rights of the citizens as it should be, but we're better off today than we were, say, 20 years ago. There was a time when just being an opposition activist, you wouldn't find any haven across West Africa. It was difficult. I mean, where we are today is a result of what's happened over the last 20 years. It's important to point that out. There used to be in the past where, because there was no space for in the political space, the only way to change the government was through a coup d'etat or a civil war. And all across the continent, including West Africa, there were a number of civil wars, a number of coup d'etats. Two things have changed. First, countries have stopped supporting rebels from the other country, right? And so governments have now taken they now have the protection that the territory of the other country is not going to be used to unseat them. And so because of that, there's beginning this backsliding. So I honestly think that we have made progress. That progress is at risk. And there are things that exist now that can help us to do that. One is the ECOWAS Code. I know that not all of his rulings have been followed, right? But there have been instances, and I gave an example of a Nigerian citizen who showed up in our country and felt he was wronged by the government, and then sued the government at the ECOWAS Court, and we were forced to restitute what he got. Now, obviously, when it comes to political questions about people in power, the courts haven't been as strong because the courts, again, are formed by, it is those governments that gave instructions for them to be able to do it. So I think with what Farida has explained what's happening in Togo, what's going on in Guinea and in Côte d'Ivoire, we are now facing the risk of civil war again as the only way to be able to change governments if the governments do not allow the peaceful process to happen. And currently, I mean, there are Ivorian citizens in Liberia who fled during the elections just recently, who've become refugees in Liberia, and Côte d'Ivoire carries the risk of a war, because of the third term. So I think these risks exist, but I just wanted to sort of take a longer view and say that we are significant in terms of the quality of governance on the continent. Is definitely not where it was 20 years ago. And hopefully, more and more changes can happen so that 20 years from now, we're not having this exact same conversation. Just wanted to.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. As I mentioned, we're running a bit short in time. So what I'd love to do right now is hand the keys over to my esteemed colleagues, Muntade and Professor Nick Cheeseman, for our Q&A session. And before we go to Muntade for our questions, I know we've received quite a few from the region. But to Nick, thank you for joining us, of course, as always. As someone who has spent their life researching democracy in Africa, I know the audience would certainly be interested to hear what your work has to say about these issues we've been discussing today. So in your estimation, where is West Africa headed? And how does the upcoming election in Ghana, which we've talked a bit about today, how does that factor in here? What are you looking out for in particular? And let's after that go to Muntade and see what we have from our audience.
Well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks to all the panelists. It's great to see these cross-national conversations, which we don't always get, and I think are really informative. I think one of the things that I would like to have people talk a little bit more about is, West Africa is remarkable in a sense in that it managed to find a way to put the military back in the barracks. And Ghana is perhaps the best example of this, but of course Nigeria to an extent. We could say that President Buhari is back, but after a civil war and a long period of military rule, moved away from that. And I think, one of the things that we perhaps want to talk about today and put more centrally is the role of the security forces and the role of the army. And that lesson from Ghana about how you actually civilianize your government and you take the military out of politics, you take the security forces out, is a really important one. So maybe I'd ask Prof. Jimaboni to tell us a little bit more about how Ghana achieved that, and whether or not across West Africa, one of the things we really need to be worrying about, if we look at the coup in Mali, for example, is the return of the security forces and the military to political prominence. But I wanted just to go back to something that others were saying about this point, about the fact that actually we've seen substantial improvements over the last 10, 15 years. And I think it's really important not to lose sight of that. I'm going to try and do a little piece of political science alchemy here and see if I'm actually able to achieve this. And if I am, hopefully in 1 second, I will magically reappear and you will see a graph. And this graph will show you that actually at the start of the multi-party politics period, all of the regions in Africa had roughly the same level of democracy on average. You see there, everyone's grouped together at the beginning. But what you can see, and important to say that on this graph, the lower scores mean more democracy. So going down means becoming more democratic. What you can see here is West Africa and Southern Africa basically become fairly steadily more democratic all the way from 1990 for the first 25 years of democratization. And actually East and Central Africa basically become more authoritarian or flatline. So there's a real kind of shift here where West Africa and Southern Africa are really driving the democratization of Africa, and East Africa and Central Africa really aren't moving very much. Now, if you look at this, the figures the last few years, what you actually find is that West Africa continues to make this improvement. And actually on some indicators, it actually improves and beats South Africa, becomes the most democratic region in the whole continent around 2016. But in 2017, on most indicators, it starts to go down again. So this shift downwards in democracy is not something of this year. It's something that seems to be happening in 2016-17. That seems to be the turning point. So the question I guess I would like to ask the panelists is, what happened in 2016-17? What is the general trend that has actually stopped this kind of fairly consistent improvement over the last 25 years and reversed it in the last few years? And going back to sort of some of the most recent comments, should we be really worried about this? Is this really a reversal, or is this a blip? What are the longer term drivers actually telling us about how worried we should be about the status of West Africa as one of the continent's most democratic regions? So I'm going to leave that there, and hopefully the panelists might want to come back and say something about those points. But I think it would be great to go to the audience. We do have a lot of questions, so I'm going to pass over to Mantari, as she's going to raise a few of the questions and perhaps pick out some people who will answer them. And then I think because we are a bit pushed for time, we'll come back to the panelists and let them answer my comments and the questions from the audience in one. So that's it for me. Over to you, Mantari. What questions do you have for our team?
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. And thank you so much to everyone that sent us questions. We might not be able to read all of them, but I tried to branch as much of them as I can. So I will give a question to each of the panelists, and then I'll start with Professor Jammeh. So the question is that Ghana has opened up to the rest of the world by working closely with its diaspora community at home and outside. What will it take other countries to see the diaspora as allies rather than adversaries in the move towards fostering democracy? In a country like Cameroon, the diaspora is seen as enemies rather than partners in improving good governance and democracy. So when you answer that question, there's also a question that responded to what you mentioned earlier about the need for regional leaders that are championing democratic norms. So the question is there currently a leader in Africa that is actually an example of what you're saying? And then the next question that I'm going to ask will go to Nadia. So Nadia, your question is, when we talk about democratic backsliding, it's always pinned on the party in government, and we tend to ignore the opposition, who are largely not trusted by the electorate. Is democracy in West Africa declining due to lack of trusted alternatives? And how can we ensure that citizens see opposition parties and movements as credible alternatives? And then the next question is going to Farida. Your question is, the unexpected defeat of the former dictator in Gambia, Yahya Jammeh, in 2016 raised hopes for many in West Africa. That change through the ballot box, regardless of how entrenched a tyrant is in fact possible. But those hopes have been dashed have been dashed with what has just happened in Ivory Coast, in Guinea, and in Togo before that. The list goes on. How can the forces of change regroup and re-strategize to deal with this broad daylight robbery of the entire system by these leaders and their cronies? And then the last question that I have is going to Jude. Your question is, how can we recalibrate civil society effectiveness at this time, especially dealing with the rise in autocracy in the region that has included the term elongation case and the systematic dismantling of regional institutions and normative frameworks? I hope that everyone got their question, so it will go in that order. We will start with the professor and then go to Nadia, Farida, and end with Jude.
Thank you, Mantati. Just quick responses to the question about where is the West African leadership that is going to be leading the fight against democratic backsliding. I don't have an answer to that, but I do hope that ECOWAS finds its way of to come up with another Dr. Ibn Chambers, and that we should sort of have Dr. Chambers as the kind of model of a regional leader who can lead the regional fight, the regional battle in support and in favor of democracy and good governance. The question on the contribution or the implications of the African diaspora to Ghanaian democratization and so on is a bit more complex, because first we're talking of two diasporas. There is the very large Ghanaian diaspora, mainly in the West, that has been generally a force for pushing the frontiers of democracy in Ghana from their perch abroad and working and in the last 15 or so years, a lot of them have returned and some of them are active on the political scene so far. I hope we continue to get that kind of positive feedback from the Ghanaians in the diaspora. But there is also the now very strong contingent of Blacks in the diaspora who have been making homecoming trips to Ghana. I think that Ghanaians and the Ghanaian authorities do recognize that one of the reasons that they are coming is the relative openness of Ghanaian society, is the relative freedom, and the fact that in Ghana today, you are not likely to be accosted by a gun-wielding military man who will harass you or who will be asking you questions. And so I think the wind of freedom and liberty that democracy has brought to Ghana is part of why Ghana is a happy place for Black diasporans to return to. And so again, the leadership of the Ghanaian tourism industry and the Ghanaian political leadership in general, I hope, do recognize this and will then motivate them to keep the democratic gains and avoid the kind of backsliding that we are seeing elsewhere in the region. I have some responses to Professor Cheeseman's questions, but I will wait for this round, if you don't mind, and I'd like to come back to him, if not today, maybe on another occasion.
Thank you so much, Professor. Nadia?
Sorry, could you please get back to your question? I lost the connection, the internet went, so if you don't mind. I only heard the role of civil society and I lost the connection, please.
Okay, so your question says, when we talk about democratic backsliding, it's always pinned on the party in government, and we tend to ignore the opposition, who are largely not trusted by the electorate. Is democracy in West Africa declining due to the lack of trusted alternatives? And how can we ensure that citizens see opposition parties and movements as credible alternatives?
So thank you very much for this very interesting question. It's important to mention that for Guinea, the UFDG, with the Union of the Democratic Forces of Guinea, is one of the strongest political opposition in the West African sub-region. So the people of Guinea, the electorate of Guinea, voted massively for Mr. Cellou Dalein Diallo. And maybe since we are talking about election, I would like to share with you what I found very innovative and creative. It's regarding the technological device we implemented for this election of 2018, for October 18, 2020. My party implemented a technical system which enable us to obtain the elections in a real time. So what we did, because we didn't act as earlier as the previous presidential election. It was not just saying that we won this election. It was to demonstrate that the people of Guinea vote for us. So it was very important for us to give the solid evidence claiming our victory. So what we did, we recruited, we trained, and we deployed in each of these 50 delegate assistants. And these two people who were deployed in each polling station were able to send us to capture and transfer electronically to our party headquarters all the copy of what we call minutes. I think procès verbal in French. So the minutes, as soon as it was drawn up at the end of the count. So it's very important for the opposition to base their strategy on this kind of technology. How technology can provide us some tools to secure the vote. So it's also important to mention that for the Guinea case, we were not alone. We created a big coalition of political parties, of civil societies. I think that you heard about what we call FNDC, the National Front for the Defense of the Constitution, which was a coalition of political parties, of trade unions, of lawyers, and organization of civil society to fiercely express our opposition to this third term. But it's interesting to mention that we disagree on the modus operandi, because for the civil society, unless a part of a civil society taking part to this election of 2020 was not a good idea, because it's a kind of, it's like we are acting, we are giving a legitimacy to the constitution of Alpha Condé. We said, no, look at there's a lot of disappointment. Alpha Condé didn't fulfill his promises. So, and we can explain the massive rally of the Guinean electoral by the how can I say that, the excitement and the optimism that this election of 2020 creates. So you can see a very an attraction. All the people of Guinea went out and voted. So that's a sign of a massive adhesion to this election, even if we can call into question the legitimacy and the legality of the constitution. But we decided to take part to this election because we say that Alpha Condé is weakened even in his own strongholds. He lost the confidence of his electorate, and now it didn't have any voters, but he had an army composed of ministers of the civil administration, political administration, military administration, who organized a fraudulent system. So for the people of Guinea, we didn't have any troubles to obtain their confidence. And I can tell you that some images undertook a very, very interesting electoral campaign in all the countryside. And this is an interesting point because during to the massive rallies we had in the countryside, that's why Alpha Condé decided to go out of his palace, of this presidential palace, and to campaign, because Alpha Condé began campaigning only 4 or 5 days before the end of the campaign. Because it was saying that, okay, look at it can be very difficult for, at the first round, let me go out my palace and let me not do my campaign only on Zoom as we are doing now. So to me, the Guinean people was very, very excited about this election of 2020.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Farida.
I'm still on mute. Thank you for your question. To respond to the question in regards to how can the forces of change kind of like work together to defeat authoritarian regimes in West Africa, I will say that it is important for the forces that are fighting, each of them in their corners against dictatorship and authoritarianism in the West African region, approach the democratic struggle as a common cause. The same way that African leaders, politicians, civil society organizers approach independence back in the 50s, the 40s, and work together to defeat the colonial system, then we should also have a system and we work together to defeat the dictators in our region. Instead of approaching democracy as an individual country project, I feel like working together and ensuring that the ECOWAS protocol of democracy and human rights is observed and respected in each of the countries, providing capacity building to the different activists working in the region, and also the politicians working towards democracy on how to secure democracy in West Africa, I believe can help us move a little faster. Because if, for example, in one country, people succeed at defeating dictatorship, like it was the case in the Gambia, and then the same year you have other countries backsliding into dictatorship, like it's the same in Togo or Guinea or Côte d'Ivoire, it feels like we'll have one step forward and 20 steps backward. So it has to be a together project, and we have to be able to harness the solidarity among the different organizations and political parties and groups that are working towards building democracy in West Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farida. And just to close off the Q&A from my end, I'll just go back to the professor. He had said that he would like to respond to some of Nick Chisman's questions.
Well, I haven't spoken.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's all right.
I apologize. I
was just going to add quickly, because we've taken a lot of time. I was just saying that, a force for good for the democratic campaigners and activists on the continent is definitely the diaspora. I mean, and the availability of tools that didn't exist before, especially with social media. In Nigeria, when the government shut down accounts that were providing money into the NSARS movement, people began to use cryptocurrencies. As it stands today, the government of Nigeria is attempting to defend itself against a CNN report that was based on Instagram Live that was done there, and pictures and videos from people who were present. So when the racist events happened in China, most African governments were content not to say anything, but it was African citizens online who shamed their governments into responding in some way. So I believe for people who are fighting for democracy, the diaspora provides an excellent tool, because in some instances, the diaspora carry two citizenship. They're citizens of Western countries and citizens of their own countries. And so if we created a world in which the people who are fighting against the dictators across the continent, the autocrats across the continent, found no haven anywhere, then it becomes harder for them to do what they're doing. So my hope is that this trend that we've seen over the last 2 decades, that we find ways to continue to move that trend in the direction that it's been going, as is in the picture behind Nick. Thank you.
If I may come in quickly.
Thank you so much, Juday.
And if I may come in quickly, just to say to Nick that Ghana was nowhere as militarized as the Nigerian politics was. So it's a bit of a comparison of apples and oranges, and also the same, it wasn't as militarized as Guinea. So maybe Ghana is more comparable to Senegal. And no wonder civil-military relations have remained democratized as Ghana in Senegal. So perhaps the debate has to be, to the extent that Ghana had some significant exposure to military rule, how did Ghana manage to democratize civil-military rule? And it's a longer conversation to be had, but in general, it took a lot of careful, systematic work by domestic civil society to win the military of Ghana and the security forces away from the dictatorial clutches that some of them had begun to enjoy. And that we sometimes even benefited from bringing down former military dictators from Mali and from Nigeria, from elsewhere, to come and have conversations with their Ghanaian counterparts. And I was involved in some of these processes and meetings between 1998 and about 2003. And that is all to end by saying that it is possible to significantly democratize civil-military relations, but it has to be very systematically done, and it has to be done strategically and tactically, and that good results can be achieved. And I'm happy to share some of these experiences on another forum. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Prof. And I think on that hopeful note, that's a great moment to hand back to our host to wrap up. Thank you very much for all of your contributions.
Thank you so much, Mantare and Nick, for facilitating that excellent and engaging session. Thank you especially for that graph, Nick. Really, it's eye-opening and worrisome at the same time for me. So thanks for sharing it. And also thanks so much to all our listeners for taking the time to join us today. Thank you most especially to our brilliant panel. I can say with certainty that I think we can all agree that we've learned a lot today. On a personal note, the continued response to the Resistance Bureau has been tremendous, and we remain appreciative and humbled for the ongoing support. We have plans to maintain this platform moving forward. And we have some truly great episodes in the works, so definitely stay tuned. In the meantime, though, do not hesitate to follow us up on our website, that is theresistancebureau.com, and don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter there. Now, after each episode, including today's episode, we compile an extensive reading list of relevant materials and resources that will allow those who are interested in reading up and learning more about the topics that we've discussed. So we encourage you to visit our website and to also stay up to date by visiting our social media platforms on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And as a final note, this show would not be the success that it's been if it wasn't for the team effort that keeps bringing it to life. So thank you to our advisory council, member of which I'm a proud member. And also thank you for always being on call to offer your valuable insight and input. A special shout out as well to our colleague, that is Peter Dory. Peter, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing behind the scenes, even though we don't get to see you. Quite simply, we could not have done this without your expertise. And to JJ Medina, who created our new visual identity that we have recently rolled out. Thank you to everyone once again. And I'd like you guys to enjoy the rest of your day, unless Jeff has anything else to say. Otherwise, we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Bye. Goodbye.